Picture the Arctic at twilight, that liminal hour when the sky bruises purple and the ice takes on the color of old bone. The wind moves across the frozen expanse with a sound like distant singing, a chorus of pressure ridges groaning under their own impossible weight. This is a world that appears empty, lifeless, eternal. Yet beneath the silence, something stirs. The ice here is not merely frozen water. It is a vault, a library written in crystals and cold. Each layer holds the breath of ancient atmospheres, volcanic ash from eruptions that painted prehistoric skies, and perhaps, just perhaps, the echoes of voices that once called this place home. Modern geologists drill deep into the permafrost, extracting cylindrical cores that chronicle millennia. Within these frozen archives, they find pollen from flowers that bloomed when mammoths grazed nearby, seeds from grasses that fed herds beyond counting. But sometimes, in the deeper strata, they find things that shouldn't exist this far north, traces of human presence in layers dated to times when these latitudes should have been, locked beneath glaciers hundreds of meters thick. The Arctic keeps its secrets well. Where other landscapes surrender their histories to patient excavation, the North guards its past behind barriers of ice that can crush ships and erase entire expeditions from memory. Yet the whispers persist. Indigenous elders speak of lands that vanished beneath the waves. Ancient maps hint at coastlines that no longer exist. And beneath the white silence, geologists detect anomalies, geometric shadows in radar scans, patterns too regular to be natural, structures that wait in the dark. What walked here before the ice came? What cities rose and fell in the long epochs before recorded history began? The frozen north holds these questions close, breathing them out slowly as glaciers calve into warming seas, as permafrost releases its grip on soil that hasn't felt sunlight in 12,000 years. This is where our journey begins, not with answers, but with the profound recognition that the Arctic was not always as we see it now. Once, impossibly, this realm of endless winter may have known the warmth of human hands, the smoke of human fires, the ambitions and dreams of civilizations that time has chosen to forget. Rewind the clock 20,000 years. The world is locked in the grip of the last glacial maximum, the deepest cold of the most recent ice age. Ice sheets, too, miles thick, crush continents beneath their weight. From orbit, Earth would appear not blue and green, but white and gray, a frozen marble spinning through the void. Yet the Arctic of this era is not the Arctic we imagine today, where now there is only frozen ocean and barren tundra. There once stretched vast grasslands, the mammoth steppe, a cold prairie unlike any ecosystem existing in the modern world. These were the hunting grounds of megafauna, woolly mammoths with curved tusks longer than a human is tall, giant ground sloths, cave lions, and short-faced bears that could look a mounted rider in the eye. Sea levels, drawn down by water, locked in continental glaciers, sit 100 meters lower than today. What we now call the Arctic Ocean presents a different geography entirely. Broader continental shelves extend like green fingers into waters that have yet to claim them. Rivers that now drain into seas once carved valleys across exposed seabeds. Forests grew where fishing trawlers now drag their nets. This is the world that holds the key to our mystery. For if humans lived in these high latitudes during this time, and we know they did from their stone tools and bone dwellings preserved in Siberian permafrost, then they witnessed something few modern humans can imagine: the slow transformation of a habitable world into an uninhabitable one. The climate was never stable during this age. Ice cores tell us of rapid shifts, temperatures plunging or rising by 10 degrees within a single generation. Entire ecosystems could collapse in decades. Rivers would freeze permanently or break free. The megafauna that had grazed for millennia would find their food sources gone, their migration routes blocked. And the people? They would have had to adapt or vanish. Some moved south, following the herds into warming lands. But what of those who stayed? What of communities that had developed over thousands of years, accumulating knowledge, refining technologies, building structures meant to last? When the ice came, not gradually, but in great lurching advances, what happened to their legacy? Memory becomes myth, becomes whisper. The stories that survived the ice speak not in clear facts, but in symbolic language. Tales of great floods, of skies that changed, of lands swallowed by darkness and cold. These are the memories encoded in the oral traditions of the oldest cultures, passed from generation to generation like heirlooms too precious to lose, but too ancient to fully understand. The ice remembers what we have forgotten. In its layers lie the scattered fragments of this lost age, waiting for patient hands to read its crystalline record. Meanwhile, beneath the cold waves of Arctic seas, another story writes itself in mud and memory. Oceanographers mapping the floor of the Barents Sea, the Kara Sea, and the shallows surrounding Svalbard have discovered something unexpected: extensive systems of submerged river valleys, ancient drainage networks that once carried meltwater from glacial highlands into what were then inland lakes and grasslands. These underwater landscapes bear the unmistakable signature of terrestrial environments, places where rain fell on exposed ground, where vegetation took root, where animals and perhaps humans walked on land that has been drowned for 10,000 years. The coastlines of the last glacial maximum told a vastly different story than those we trace on modern maps. Picture the Arctic Ocean as a smaller sea, its perimeter marked by broad coastal plains stretching hundreds of kilometers beyond where surf breaks today. These lost lowlands would have been among the most habitable regions in the far north, sheltered from the harshest polar storms by the bulk of glaciers further inland, watered by meltwater rivers in summer, rich with game. In northern Siberia, sonar surveys reveal the ghostly traces of what appears to be an ancient harbor system, regularly spaced depressions along what was once a river mouth, now lying beneath 70 meters of Arctic water. Natural formation, or the handiwork of people who understood the movements of tides and seasons? The patterns are ambiguous, tantalizing, suggestive. Off the coast of Alaska, similar discoveries emerge. The drowned valleys of Beringia, that vast land bridge connecting Asia and America, show signs of intensive use. Not just migration routes for wandering bands of hunter-gatherers, but evidence of sustained occupation. Tool deposits spanning thousands of years, processing sites where animals were butchered and prepared even possible dwelling foundations where families might have gathered through long winters. These submerged landscapes challenge our assumptions about human prehistory. For too long, the narrative has been one of scattered bands surviving on the margins of glaciated wastes. But what if the reality was richer, more complex? What if the exposed continental shelves of the Ice Age Arctic hosted communities of significant size and sophistication, peoples who developed technologies and knowledge systems adapted to the extreme environment, who built with materials that have not survived the drowning, who left their legacy not in stone monuments, but in the very migrations that peopled two continents? The ocean keeps these secrets close. Unlike terrestrial archaeology, where ruins can be excavated and studied, underwater sites in Arctic waters present formidable challenges. The cold preserves, yes, but it also conceals. Sediment accumulates over millennia, burying ancient surfaces beneath meters of mud. Ice scours the seafloor each winter, churning and mixing layers that should lie undisturbed. And the logistics of deep water archaeology in sub-zero conditions make even preliminary surveys enormously costly and dangerous. Yet the work continues. With each passing year, resolution improves on seafloor mapping surveys. Machine learning algorithms trained to recognize archaeological features begin to flag anomalies that human eyes might miss. And as the Arctic warms, tragically, catastrophically, newly exposed coastlines occasionally yield artifacts from peoples who walked the edges of this northern world when it was young. The shores remember, even as the waves erase them. Centuries earlier, In Istanbul of 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map that would perplex scholars for generations to come. The Piri Reis map, drawn on gazelle skin and decorated with elaborate calligraphy, depicts the Atlantic Ocean, bordered by the coasts of Europe, Africa, and the Americas, with remarkable accuracy for its time. But it is not the known coastlines that intrigue researchers. It is what the map shows further south. At the bottom edge, where the chart should fade into the unknown waters of the Antarctic, there appears instead a detailed coastline of mountains and bays. A coastline that matches, with eerie precision, the actual contours of Antarctica as revealed by modern surveys conducted beneath its ice sheet. Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years. Its coastline has been hidden beneath kilometers of ice since long before human civilization emerged in Mesopotamia or Egypt. How then could a 16th century map show it ice-free? Piri Reis himself provides a clue in his own annotations. He notes that his map was compiled from older sources, from charts dating back to the time of Alexander the Great and before, inherited from ancient mariners whose identities are lost to time. Could these earlier cartographers have possessed knowledge from an age before the great ice sheets formed? Or might their maps preserve information passed down from even older sources, perhaps from peoples who explored these waters when climatic conditions were vastly different? The mystery deepens with other charts. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows Antarctica not only ice-free, but with rivers, mountains, and interior detail. The Bauchet map of 1737 depicts the continent as two large islands separated by a channel, a configuration that modern, ice-penetrating radar has confirmed lies beneath the ice sheet, but which should have been invisible to pre-modern cartographers. Skeptics argue these maps merely reflect the geographical speculation of their eras, attempts to complete the world's picture based on theory rather than observation. Yet the accuracy of certain features remains difficult to dismiss entirely. The coastlines sometimes align with a precision that random guessing should not produce. And if Antarctica could be mapped before the ice, what of the Arctic? Ancient Greek geographers spoke of the Northern Ocean with surprising specificity. They described lands beyond Thule, the edge of the known world, where the sea became thick like jelly, pack ice, and where the sun never set in summer. Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek explorer from the 4th century BCE, claimed to have sailed to the Arctic Circle, describing phenomena that match what we know of polar latitudes: the midnight sun, the aurora, seas choked with floating ice. But how far north did such knowledge extend? Medieval Portolan charts of the North Atlantic sometimes show islands and coastlines that don't match modern geography, but which might match ancient coastlines before post-glacial rebound reshaped the land. Irish legends speak of High Brazil, a phantom island to the west that appeared and vanished from maps over centuries. Norse sagas describe lands beyond Greenland, some of which can be correlated to actual places, others which remain mysterious. Could these represent fragments of older cartographic traditions? Echoes of maps drawn when sea levels were lower, when Arctic islands now submerged still broke the surface when mariners of forgotten eras charted waters that would later be sealed beneath ice? The possibility whispers through the archives of ancient geography. Not proof, but suggestion. Not evidence, but invitation to wonder. What if humanity's relationship with the extreme latitudes extends deeper into time than we have imagined? What if the Arctic was mapped before it froze, and those maps, copied and recopied, corrupted and preserved, survived as fragmentary shadows in the cartographic record? The old charts offer no answers, only questions drawn in ink on crumbling parchment, pointing north toward mysteries that time and ice have wrapped in white silence. But another possibility emerges from the frozen ground itself, evidence that requires no speculation, no ancient maps, no ambiguous myths. This is the testimony of stone and bone, the archaeological record of people who unquestionably lived in the Arctic when it was a different world. In the permafrost of Siberia's Yana River Valley, Russian archaeologists have excavated a site dating to 32,000 years ago. Here, in one of the northernmost occupied locations of the Ice Age, people hunted woolly rhinoceros and mammoth, crafted sophisticated tools from rhinoceros horn and ivory, and built shelters from mammoth bone and hide. The complexity of their technology is stunning. Bone needles for sewing fitted clothing, evidence of tailored garments, essential for survival in temperatures that could plunge to minus 60 degrees, specialized tools for different tasks, showing division of labor and accumulated expertise. These were not desperate survivors clinging to existence on the edge of the habitable world. They were specialists, adapted and thriving in conditions that would kill unprepared humans within hours. Their culture persisted in the Arctic for thousands of years, weathering the climatic fluctuations that saw ice sheets advance and retreat, weathering the long dark winters and the strange light-filled summers when the sun barely touched the horizon. Further east, in Alaska, sites like Swan Point and Bluefish Caves push the timeline of human presence back even further. Stone tools, cut bones showing butchering marks, charcoal from ancient hearths, all testify to human occupation during periods when much of North America lay beneath glaciers. These northern peoples were pioneers, living on the edge of continental ice sheets, hunting megafauna that would soon vanish forever, developing knowledge systems that allowed them not just to survive, but to flourish in an environment of extraordinary harshness. But here is where the conventional narrative begins to strain under the weight of implications. If humans occupied the Arctic continuously for tens of thousands of years, what did they build that we haven't found? What knowledge did they accumulate that might not leave traces in the archaeological record? Consider the nature of preservation. Stone tools survive. Bone dwellings survive if buried quickly. But rope, fabric, leather, these decay. Wood rots. Antler and horn are gnawed by scavengers or dissolved by soil chemistry. The Arctic, ironically, both preserves and destroys. Permafrost can keep organic materials intact for millennia, but the freeze-thaw cycles at the permafrost boundary pulverize artifacts into fragments. Rivers erode away occupation layers. Ice sheets during glacial advances scrape bedrock clean, erasing everything that stood before them. What kind of civilization could these Ice Age peoples have developed that would leave no trace? Perhaps one built on materials that don't survive, structures of hide and bone, knowledge encoded in oral tradition rather than written records, technologies based on organic materials rather than metal or stone. Or perhaps we simply haven't looked in the right places yet. The majority of Arctic archaeology has focused on areas that are accessible today: dry land, exposed valleys, coastal regions where researchers can work during brief summer field seasons. But if sea levels were lower, if coastlines extended hundreds of kilometers beyond their present positions, then the major population centers of Ice Age Arctic cultures might now lie underwater, beyond the reach of conventional excavation. The mammoth hunters left us tantalizing glimpses of their world, enough to know they were here, enough to see that they were capable and inventive. But the full picture remains hidden, locked in sediments beneath Arctic seas, buried under ice sheets that have yet to release their grip, or lost to the erosions of time that spare no civilization forever. One thing is certain: they watched the world change. They saw the megafauna decline and vanish. They witnessed the warming that ended the Ice Age, the floods that drowned the coastlines, the forests that advanced northward only to retreat again. If their oral tradition survived, if any thread of memory persisted south into the lands where writing would eventually develop, what stories might those traditions tell? What wisdom might be encoded in myths we've dismissed as mere fantasy? The stone tools offer no answer. They lie in museum cases, mute witnesses to lives we can barely imagine, to an Arctic that no longer exists, to human endurance in the face of forces that reshaped continents. As the climate shifted through the millennia, one region stands out in the story of Arctic humanity, a land that existed for tens of thousands of years, then vanished beneath the waves as thoroughly as if it had never been. Beringia. The name sounds mythical, and in a sense, it is. This was the vast landmass that connected Asia to America across what is now the Bering Strait, a subcontinent in its own right, stretching from the Verkhoyansk Mountains of Siberia to the Mackenzie River in Canada. At its greatest extent during the last glacial maximum, Beringia encompassed over 1 million square kilometers of territory, a cold grassland ecosystem that supported vast herds of megafauna and the humans who hunted them. This was not a narrow bridge, as the term land bridge might suggest, but a world unto itself. Pollen records recovered from ancient lake beds show it was a mosaic environment: grassy steppes in the lowlands, stands of birch and willow in sheltered valleys, wetlands, teeming with waterfowl during summer wind-scoured ridges where only the hardiest plants could survive. Archaeological evidence demonstrates continuous human occupation for at least 15,000 years, and possibly much longer. The people of Beringia developed unique cultures adapted to this vanished landscape. They engineered specialized tools for hunting mammoth and bison, Clovis points and their predecessors, weapons requiring tremendous skill to craft. They built semi-subterranean winter dwellings reinforced with mammoth bones and tusks, structures that could withstand Arctic storms that would shred modern tents. They carved art, mammoth ivory figurines depicting animals and humans, decorative patterns that might encode information or simply express the human need for beauty, even in a harsh world. But Beringia was more than a migration corridor or hunting ground. Some researchers propose it may have been a refuge, a place where populations persisted during periods when ice sheets made other regions uninhabitable. During glacial maxima, when ice covered much of Europe and North America, Beringia remained ice-free due to low precipitation in the Arctic interior. It could have served as a reservoir of human genetic and cultural diversity, a homeland where traditions were maintained through millennia while isolated from other populations. This isolation may have allowed for cultural development we can only guess at. If Beringian populations persisted for 15,000 years or more in relative stability, they would have had time to develop complex social structures, accumulated environmental knowledge, perhaps even proto-agricultural practices adapted to Arctic conditions. Evidence suggests they managed fire to maintain grazing lands, possibly controlling the landscape to favor certain species over others. A first step toward domestication, though the path was cut short. Then, approximately 12,000 years ago, the world warmed. The ice sheets that had locked up Earth's water began their great retreat. Sea levels rose, slowly at first, then with accelerating speed. Meltwater pulses from collapsing ice dams raised global oceans by meters within decades. The low-lying areas of Beringia flooded first, then the coastal regions, then the interior lowlands. The people would have noticed the change within a generation. Rivers that once flowed fresh would have tasted salt. Hunting grounds would become marshes, then lagoons, then open sea. Communities that had inhabited the same locations for thousands of years would have been forced to retreat, to migrate, to abandon the lands their ancestors had occupied since time beyond memory. And then Beringia was gone. The Bering Strait opened, connecting the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific. What had been a subcontinent became a seabed, and the cultures that had flourished there scattered to Asia and America, their homeland lost to the waves. Today, fishing vessels drag nets across the floor of the Bering Sea and sometimes pull up mammoth teeth, stone tools, fragments of worked ivory. These are the last physical traces of Beringia, artifacts from a drowned world, clues to civilizations that vanished not by conquest or collapse, but by slow drowning as the Ice Age ended and the seas reclaimed the land. What knowledge was lost when Beringia flooded? What stories went silent when the last Beringian elders died without an audience who remembered the old world? We will likely never know. The ocean keeps these secrets in cold darkness, beneath sediments that accumulate millimeter by millimeter, century by century, slowly burying the past beneath the weight of the present. But the genetic legacy of Beringia survives. Native peoples across the Americas carry genetic markers that point to origins in this vanished land. The languages, the myths, the technologies, all bear traces of a common source in a place that no longer exists, but which shaped the human story in ways we are only beginning to understand. Beringia is gone, but its children walked forth to populate 2 continents, carrying with them fragments of Arctic wisdom, memories encoded in stories, adaptations learned in the cold. The land is lost, the legacy endures. Yet the ice has not always reigned supreme in these latitudes. Geological records reveal a secret that transforms our understanding of what the Arctic could have been. Evidence that the far north has oscillated between frozen waste and temperate paradise multiple times across deep time. On the island of Svalbard, halfway between Norway and the North Pole, geologists have found fossilized forests. Not stunted tundra scrub, but true forests, trees that grew to substantial height, leaf litter from deciduous species that require warm summers to survive. The age of these fossils stretches back millions of years to epochs when atmospheric carbon was higher and global climates were warmer, but some date to more recent interglacial periods, warm intervals between ice ages when temperatures in the Arctic were substantially higher than today. Greenland tells a similar story. Core samples drilled through the ice sheet extract fragments of plant material, seeds, even insects from layers dated to the last interglacial period, approximately 120,000 years ago. During this time, southern Greenland appears to have been largely ice-free, supporting boreal forests and temperatures warm enough that the islandess name, given by Eric the Red as a marketing ploy, might have been genuinely descriptive. These warm phases were not brief anomalies, but lasted thousands of years, long enough for forests to establish, for species to migrate northward, for entire ecosystems to reorganize around a temperate Arctic. And they raise a compelling question. If such conditions existed within the time frame of modern human existence, could humans have inhabited the Arctic during these warm periods? Anatomically, modern humans emerged approximately 300,000 years ago. The last major warm interglacial occurred 120,000 years ago and lasted for several thousand years. The Eemian interglacial, as it's called, saw temperatures in the Arctic several degrees warmer than today, sea levels higher, and habitable conditions extending far into northern latitudes. Did humans reach the Arctic during this time? Did they establish communities in a green and temperate north? Conventional archaeology says no. The earliest undisputed evidence for humans in the Arctic dates to around 40,000 years ago, during the last ice age, not during warm periods. But the Eemian ended abruptly when the climate plunged back into glaciation, and ice sheets kilometers thick advanced across the very regions where Eemian warmth had created habitable conditions. If humans had been present, their archaeological sites would have been obliterated, scraped clean by advancing glaciers, crushed beneath ice, bulldozed into the sea as glaciers calved into rising oceans. The possibility remains speculative, but not implausible. Modern humans were in Africa and spreading into Eurasia during the Eemian. They were cognitively identical to us, capable of complex planning, symbolic thought, and technological innovation. If climatic conditions in the Arctic were favorable, why wouldn't they explore these regions? Perhaps they did. Perhaps communities flourished in an Arctic that was green and rich, that knew forests and flowing rivers, that offered abundant hunting and fishing. Perhaps they developed cultures adapted to the unique conditions of polar latitudes, the midnight sun, the long winter darkness, the dramatic seasonal shifts that require different survival strategies than any other environment on Earth. And then the cold returned. Within a few generations, the climate would have shifted. Summers would have cooled, winters lengthened. Forests would have retreated, giving way to tundra, then ice. Any humans present would have faced a choice: migrate south with the habitable climate zones, or perish in the cold. Most would have left, carrying with them memories of a northern homeland now lost to ice. But memories encoded in myth are resilient. Stories of a paradise in the north, a land of eternal light, a place where the ancestors once dwelled before the world grew cold. These motifs appear in multiple ancient cultures. Could they preserve fragmentary memories of the warm Arctic, passed down through so many generations that their literal truth was forgotten, but their symbolic power remained? The ice cores hold the climatic record, layer by layer, back through multiple glacial cycles. They show us that the Arctic has been warm before and will likely be warm again. But they cannot tell us who was there to witness the changes. They cannot preserve the stories told around fires and forests that vanished before recorded history began. The hypothesis remains unproven, but tantalizing. A warm Arctic inhabited by early humans, then frozen and forgotten, leaving only the faintest traces in myth and genetic memory. It is a story written in ice and fossil wood, in the patterns of glacial advance and retreat, in the silences where archaeology cannot yet reach. Meanwhile, in the oral traditions of the peoples who have inhabited the Arctic rim for countless generations, another kind of evidence persists. Stories that speak of lands beyond the known world, places where the rules of normal existence bend and break. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia preserve legends of Ailuhak, the holy mountain in the far north where the sun never sets, where the old gods still dwell beyond the reach of mortal concerns. Their stories speak of ancient times when travel to this sacred place was possible, when shamans could journey there in trance to seek wisdom from the spirits who remember all things. The Inuit of Canada and Greenland tell of Konak, a place of eternal light at the top of the world where the souls of the dead travel. In some versions, Komak is described as a land of abundance where caribou are always plentiful and the sea never freezes, where the people live in harmony and hunger is unknown, a paradise preserved at the edge of existence. The Chukchi people of far northeastern Siberia describe lands across the northern ocean where different rules apply, where spirits walk openly and time moves strangely. These are not dismissed as mere fantasy in traditional Chukchi cosmology, but are described, with the specificity usually reserved for real places, with details about their geography and the beings that inhabit them. Scholars of mythology have often interpreted such stories as symbolic, metaphors for spiritual states, cultural values encoded in narrative form, or simple entertainment. But some researchers have begun to ask whether these myths might also preserve fragments of historical memory, distorted and transformed over millennia, but retaining a core of experiential truth. Consider the consistent themes: light without end, abundance, lands now unreachable. These are precisely the conditions that would describe the Arctic during warm interglacial periods when explored in summer. The midnight sun is real, not mythological, and its psychological impact on human consciousness is profound. Travelers to the Arctic often report a sense of temporal disorientation, as if normal time has been suspended. The abundance of wildlife during Arctic summers can be stunning. Millions of migrating birds, vast caribou herds, salmon runs that turn rivers silver. What if the myths of northern paradise preserve memories of actual places, regions of the Arctic that were verdant and accessible during warm climatic phases, but which became frozen and inaccessible when the climate shifted? As these lands became unreachable, memory would transform them. Real places would become mythologized, their geography blending with spiritual significance, their histories merging with cosmological narratives. But the core might remain. These were real places once, where our ancestors walked before the ice or sea claimed them. The timing aligns intriguingly. Many northern indigenous cultures trace their oral traditions back with remarkable fidelity. Studies comparing oral histories to archaeological and geological records have shown that some indigenous narratives accurately describe events from 10,000 years ago or more: volcanic eruptions, sea level changes, megafaunal extinctions. If oral tradition can preserve these kinds of specific environmental memories across 100 centuries, might it also preserve memories of lost Arctic homelands? The Hyperborean myths of classical Greece speak of a people beyond the north wind who lived in perpetual sunlight and peace, who were blessed by Apollo and knew neither disease nor old age. Herodotus and other ancient historians described the Hyperborea as real but inaccessible, a place that existed beyond the known world. Later writers embellished these stories into pure fantasy, but the earliest versions have a different quality. They speak of Hyperboreans with the same matter-of-fact tone used for discussing Persians or Egyptians, as if they were believed to be actual people in an actual place. Could the Hyperborean myth have originated as Greek trading cultures encountered peoples who carried stories of their origins from far northern lands that seemed paradisiacal in memory, lands that couldn't be reached anymore because they had been swallowed by climate change or rising seas? The questions spiral outward. If myths preserve memories, and memories extend back before recorded history, then oral tradition becomes a form of archaeology, excavating not ground, but the accumulated narratives of human experience. The stories of eternal dawn of lost northern lands of ancestors who dwelled beyond the edge of the world might be our oldest maps, drawn not in ink, but in words pointing toward civilizations that existed in the Arctic when the Arctic was a different world. The myths remember what the ice has buried. They whisper across centuries, insistent, haunting, impossible to prove, yet equally impossible to dismiss. Somewhere between fantasy and history, these stories hold space for possibilities that archaeology has not yet confirmed, but cannot completely rule out, that the Arctic Circle once enclosed not just ice and emptiness, but cultures, communities, and the light of human fires against the eternal dawn. Pause for a moment on an odd detail, a fragment of the impossible made real. In 2010, researchers drilling through permafrost on Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic pulled up something unexpected from a depth of 20 meters, a perfectly preserved piece of petrified wood frozen in place since the Pliocene epoch, approximately 3 million years ago. The wood came from a metasequoia tree, a dawn redwood that once stood 30 meters tall. But dawn redwoods cannot survive in Arctic conditions. They require warm temperate climates, substantial rainfall, long growing seasons. Today they exist only in a tiny refuge in central China and as ornamentals in botanical gardens. Yet here was irrefutable evidence that they once grew near the Arctic Circle, in soil that is now permanently frozen, under a sun that now barely rises in winter. Further analysis revealed pollen from multiple temperate tree species, cypress, beech, hemlock, alongside the redwood. This wasn't a single anomalous tree, but an entire forest ecosystem, a woodland that would look more at home in modern-day Virginia or Japan than in the high Arctic. The climate that supported this forest was at least 15 degrees Celsius warmer than present conditions, with year-round temperatures above freezing and substantial precipitation. This forest stood for thousands of years. Trees grew, matured, died, and were replaced by seedlings. Animals lived in the undergrowth. Rivers flowed through valleys now scoured by ice. It was a functioning, stable ecosystem in a location that is now one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Then the climate shifted. The Pliocene warmth gave way to the beginning of the ice age cycles that have characterized the past 2 million years. The forests retreated, replaced by tundra, then by ice. The trees fell and were buried in sediment that froze solid, preserving their cellular structure in exquisite detail. For 3 million years, they waited in darkness until human hands brought them back into light. The petrified wood from Ellesmere Island sits now in museums and research collections, a witness to Arctic variability that defies our intuitive understanding. If forests could thrive in the high Arctic 3 million years ago, what might have thrived there 1 million years ago? 100,000 years ago? What ecosystems rose and fell in the intervals between ice ages, leaving only fragmentary traces in the frozen ground? The Arctic was not always white. It was green, brown, the gold of autumn leaves, the infinite shades of living forests breathing under midnight suns and winter stars. The ice that seems eternal is, in geological terms, a recent arrival, a temporary condition that has erased what came before, but may itself be temporary in turn. The trees, remember, in their way. Locked in permafrost, they testify to a different Arctic, impossible yet real, vanished yet preserved, waiting in the cold. But another possibility emerges from the most unlikely source, not from excavation or ancient texts, but from space. In 2016, NASA released high-resolution ice-penetrating radar surveys of Greenland, part of ongoing efforts to map the bedrock topography hidden beneath the ice sheet. The primary purpose was glaciological. Understanding ice thickness and subglacial geology helps predict how the ice sheet will respond to warming. But as researchers processed the data, some noticed anomalies that didn't fit standard geological expectations. Beneath the ice in southeastern Greenland, the radar revealed large, roughly circular formations with internal structures suggestive of geometric organization. Natural geological features, volcanic calderas, impact craters, collapsed lava tubes, can create circular patterns. But these formations showed something different. Apparent right-angle features, parallel lines, rectangular voids that repeated in regular patterns. The structures lie beneath approximately 2 kilometers of ice. Dating the ice sheet at this location suggests the surface was last exposed more than 12,000 years ago, before the Holocene warming that ended the last ice age. If the formations are artificial, then that remains a massive if they would predate any known civilization by thousands of years. Skepticism is warranted and necessary. Radar data can be difficult to interpret. Geological processes can create patterns that superficially resemble artificial structures. Pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and meaning in random data, affects scientific interpretation as much as everyday perception. Peer review of the anomalies has been mixed, with most researchers favoring natural geological explanations, but the possibility refuses to die entirely. Because if one asks the question seriously, could ancient humans have built in the Arctic before the ice came? Then the answer involves considering what we know about human capability, climate history, and the nature of archaeological evidence. Modern humans have existed for approximately 300,000 years. For most of that time, we've lived in small groups, using stone tools, following migrating herds. But we've also shown remarkable capacity for innovation when circumstances demanded. The construction of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive stone temple complex built 11,500 years ago by people who supposedly hadn't yet invented agriculture, demonstrates that assumptions about prehistoric capability have often been too conservative. If a warm climatic period opened the Arctic to habitation, if populations grew large enough to require organized infrastructure, if they had thousands of years to develop construction techniques adapted to local conditions, what might they have built? Stone foundations for dwellings, perhaps carved partially into bedrock for insulation and stability. Communal structures for seasonal gatherings. Storage pits for preserving meat and fish through winter. Fish weirs in rivers. Stone arrangements for funneling caribou migrations toward hunting sites. None of these would require advanced technology, just time, labor, and accumulated intergenerational knowledge. When the ice came, it would have buried these structures completely. The advancing glaciers would have crushed some, preserved others, rearranged materials into confusing patterns. After 12,000 years under ice, distinguishing artificial from natural features would be nearly impossible without direct excavation, which cannot happen beneath 2 kilometers of ice. So the radar anomalies remain ambiguous. Provocative patterns that might be cities or might be nothing more than unusual geology. Visible through ice but unreachable, inviting speculation but offering no proof. The ice sheet shifts slowly toward the sea. In tens of thousands of years, if current trends continue, Greenland's ice will largely melt, and the bedrock will emerge into sunlight for the first time in millennia. If there is anything artificial beneath the ice, it will eventually be revealed. But by then, who will be watching? What civilization will inherit the Arctic's secrets? For now, the possible cities remain theoretical, shadows and radar data, ghost stories whispered by machines. But the whisper is persistent. What if? What if beneath the ice sheet, foundations wait? What if the white silence hides not emptiness but ruins, the bones of an Arctic civilization that time and climate erased from memory? The ice will not answer yet. It holds its silence, 2 kilometers deep. Consider the sheer scale of what the Greenland ice sheet conceals. Covering approximately 1.7 million square kilometers, an area larger than Alaska, the ice sheet entombs an entire subcontinent. The bedrock beneath exhibits mountain ranges taller than the Alps, canyon systems that dwarf the Grand Canyon, vast lowland basins that were once lakes or inland seas. This is not a flat, simple geology, but a complex landscape frozen in time. Recent high-resolution surveys have revealed even more surprising features. In northern Greenland, radar detected what appears to be a massive impact crater, 30 kilometers in diameter, created by an asteroid or comet strike within the past 3 million years. The discovery astonished scientists because the crater was completely invisible from the surface. Hidden beneath ice, its existence unsuspected until technology allowed us to see through the frozen veil. If a 30-kilometer crater can hide beneath the ice for millennia, what else might be concealed? The question becomes not whether something could be hidden, but whether we would recognize it if we found it. Archaeology beneath ice presents unique preservation conditions. In temperate climates, organic materials decay, metals corrode, stone structures are weathered by rain and wind, roots break apart foundations. But under ice, processes halt. Temperatures remain constant at far below freezing. No water flows to dissolve or transport materials. No organisms consume organic matter. The pressure of ice above creates a kind of suspended animation where nothing changes, nothing moves, nothing decays. When archaeologists excavate sites in Siberian permafrost, they sometimes find organic preservation so perfect that mammoth carcasses still have intact muscle tissue, recognizable last meals in their stomachs. Frozen human burials from Scythian times emerge with clothing, tattoos, and even facial expressions preserved. The cold is a vault more perfect than any Egyptian tomb. If, hypothetically, there were structures beneath Greenland's ice, they might be preserved in states that defy normal archaeological expectations. Wood would not rot. Leather and fabric might survive intact. Whatever materials were used, whatever artifacts were left, they would wait in the darkness, suspended in time, for the moment when the ice releases them. But that moment is not today, nor likely in our lifetimes. The ice remains too thick, too inaccessible. Drilling through 2 kilometers of ice is technically possible, but extraordinarily expensive and logistically challenging. Any excavation would require enormous investment for uncertain return. In an era of limited archaeological funding, no institution is likely to bankroll such an expedition based on ambiguous radar anomalies. So the mystery persists in a strange state of suspension. The technology exists to see that something unusual might be there, but the technology to investigate directly does not yet exist in practical form. We are left in an epistemic limbo, knowing enough to suspect, but not enough to confirm or deny. The ice sheet will eventually reveal its secrets, with or without human intervention. As climate warms, the margins of the ice retreat, exposing ground that has been frozen for thousands of years. Already, in southern Greenland, ancient artifacts are emerging from melting ice patches. Arrows, tools, clothing from Norse and pre-Norse eras, preserved perfectly by cold. These finds hint at what might lie deeper, further in, beneath the thicker ice that has not yet begun to melt. But by the time the deep ice melts, if it melts, the Arctic will be transformed beyond recognition. The ecosystems will be different, the cultures changed, the very Earth altered by forces we cannot fully predict. The ruins, if they exist, will emerge into a world utterly unlike the one they knew. For now, they wait. The radar anomalies glow faintly on computer screens, geometric whispers in ice, suggesting patterns that might be nothing, that might be everything. Scientists debate interpretations, weigh probabilities, plan future surveys that might refine the data or reveal new mysteries. And beneath 2 kilometers of ice, whatever lies there remains imperfect. Darkness and perfect silence, preserved or destroyed, real or imaginary, waiting for the moment when ice becomes memory, and the frozen past rises into the light of an uncertain future. Yet the ice is not the only repository of Arctic mysteries. The seas themselves hold stories written in currents and myth, in the logs of ancient mariners who ventured into waters that tested the limits of human courage. Long before Columbus sailed west, seafarers probed the northern oceans. The Vikings, celebrated for their Atlantic crossings, were latecomers to a tradition that stretches much deeper into time. Archaeological evidence places sophisticated maritime cultures in Scandinavia as early as 10,000 years ago. People who built seaworthy vessels, who understood celestial navigation, who harvested the resources of cold northern waters with skill born of generations. But how far north did these ancient mariners venture? The conventional narrative suggests that extreme Arctic waters remained unexplored until the age of modern polar expeditions. Yet hints scattered through ancient texts and archaeological finds suggest otherwise. Greek historians recorded accounts of Pytheas of Massalia, who in the 4th century BCE sailed far beyond the Mediterranean into the northern Atlantic. His journey took him past Britain to a land he called Thule, 6 days' sail north of the British Isles, where the sun barely set in summer and the sea became sluggish, mixed with something resembling jellyfish. Scholars debate the identity of Thule. Iceland? Norway? The Faroe Islands? But Pytheas' descriptions match phenomena seen in the Arctic. Pack ice appearing like gelatinous masses on the water's surface. The midnight sun creating conditions where day and night blur into continuous light. Pytheas was a trained astronomer and geographer. His measurements of latitude were remarkably accurate, and he correctly explained the relationship between the moon and tides, insights that would be lost and rediscovered centuries later. If his astronomical observations can be trusted, why dismiss his geographical claims? Perhaps Pytheas did reach the Arctic Circle, becoming one of the first Mediterranean explorers to document polar phenomena. But Pytheas may have been following routes already ancient. Irish legends speak of Saint Brendan, who in the 6th century CE supposedly sailed the Atlantic in a leather boat and encountered floating crystal pillars, icebergs, islands that moved, ice floes, and a land of fire and smoke, volcanic Iceland. The asterisk Navigatio Sancti Brendani asterisk describes these wonders in detail that sometimes aligns eerily with actual Arctic conditions. More intriguing are the hints of pre-Norse explorers. Stone alignments along the Norwegian coast show evidence of astronomical sophistication, dating back 5,000 years. Structures that might have served as navigational markers for seafarers traveling along the Arctic rim. Rock carvings in northern Scandinavia depict sophisticated vessels from the Bronze Age, ships capable of long ocean voyages, suggesting maritime traditions with deep roots in prehistory. If these ancient northern peoples possessed advanced boat-building technology and navigational knowledge, where did they go? The Arctic seas, though dangerous, are not impassable. Summer opens leads through the pack ice. Currents create predictable routes. Seabirds and marine mammals signal the presence of land beyond the horizon. For mariners born to these waters, attuned to their rhythms through generations of accumulated wisdom, the Arctic would not be an insurmountable barrier, but a highway connecting distant coasts. Consider the Thule people, Inuit ancestors, who spread rapidly across the North American Arctic around 1,000 years ago, traveling in skin boats from Alaska to Greenland in mere centuries. Their maritime technology allowed them to hunt whales in open ocean, to navigate through ice-choked waters, to establish communities on remote islands where survival depended on reading the sea's moods with perfect accuracy. If the Thule could accomplish this with Stone Age technology, what might earlier peoples with equally refined skills have achieved? The Dorset culture, which preceded the Thule in the Canadian Arctic, left behind evidence of sophisticated maritime adaptation, extending back 4,000 years. They hunted seals and walrus through sea ice, suggesting intimate knowledge of ice dynamics and marine mammal behavior. Their settlement patterns along Arctic coastlines hint at regular maritime travel over vast distances, connecting communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of treacherous waters. Further back still, the archaeological record grows fragmentary, but tantalizing pieces emerge. Stone tools characteristic of Siberian cultures appear on Arctic islands that could only be reached by boat. Organic remains on isolated archipelagos suggest brief human presence thousands of years before any known maritime cultures existed in the region. These traces pose uncomfortable questions. Who were these people? How did they get there? What knowledge did they possess that allowed them to navigate Arctic seas when such voyages should have been impossible? Perhaps the answer lies not in single expeditions, but in gradual processes. Coastal peoples slowly expanding their range, generation by generation, learning the secrets of ice and current, developing technologies suited to extreme conditions. Over millennia, this expansion might have created networks of Arctic mariners whose knowledge spanned the polar regions, who exchanged information and goods across vast distances, who knew the northern seas as intimately as later sailors knew the Mediterranean. Such maritime traditions leave little archaeological trace. Boats built of hide and wood decay. Navigational knowledge exists in oral tradition and embodied skill, not written charts. The infrastructure of seafaring cultures, docks, warehouses, shipyards require settled communities that might have existed on coastlines now drowned by post-glacial sea level rise. Yet echoes persist. The Hyperboreans of Greek myth were described as great sailors who could travel at will across the northern ocean, who maintained contact with the Mediterranean world through intermediaries, who possessed wisdom about stars and seasons that Greeks found remarkable. Were these descriptions of actual maritime peoples encountered through the amber trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean? Stories garbled through translation and cultural misunderstanding, but preserving kernels of truth about northern seafarers, whose culture was ancient even when Greece was young? The sea remembers in its own way. Shipwrecks litter Arctic waters, some from known historical periods, others so ancient and fragmentary that their origins remain mysterious. Every few years, storms or shifting sands expose timbers from vessels that predate known Arctic exploration. Radiocarbon dates sometimes return results that place these wrecks far earlier than expected, raising questions about who built them, where they were sailing, and what knowledge was lost when they foundered. The North Seas whisper of mariners who have no names, whose journeys are recorded only in artifacts too fragmentary to fully interpret, whose courage and skill carried them into waters we can barely imagine traversing in their fragile vessels. They navigated by stars and seabirds, by the taste of water and the color of clouds on the horizon, by knowledge accumulated over lifetimes and passed from hand to hand through generations. Some reached their destinations. Others vanished into fog and ice, their fates unrecorded, their bones settling to ocean floors where no one would find them. But they went north, driven by curiosity or necessity, by the human compulsion to see what lies beyond the horizon, to test themselves against the ultimate challenge of the frozen seas. The currents still follow the same patterns they always have. The stars still wheel overhead in their ancient paths. And somewhere in those dark waters, the lost mariners of the North Seas sleep in their wooden vessels, surrounded by the cold, wrapped in stories that no one living can tell. But perhaps the most persistent myth of the Arctic is also the oldest, the tale of Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, the paradise that existed at the edge of the world. Hyperborea appears in Greek literature as early as the 7th century BCE, mentioned by poets and historians with a curious consistency. Unlike many mythological locations that shift and change with each retelling, Hyperborea maintains certain stable characteristics across different sources. It lies far to the north, beyond the realm of Boreas the north wind. Its inhabitants live in perpetual happiness, free from war, disease, and the ravages of age. The sun shines continuously for 6 months of the year, and the Hyperboreans maintain some connection to Apollo, the god of light and prophecy. Herodotus, the Greek historian often called the father of history, wrote of Hyperborea with an intriguing mixture of skepticism and acceptance. He doubted some of the more fantastical claims, the extreme longevity of the Hyperboreans, their supposed ability to fly, but he treated the place itself as real, discussing trade connections between Hyperborea and the Greek world through intermediary peoples. He described offerings sent from Hyperborea to the sanctuary of Apollo on Delos, wrapped in wheat straw and passed from nation to nation until they reached the Aegean. Pindar, the great lyric poet, wrote of Hyperborea as a place where neither disease nor bitter old age is mixed in their sacred blood. Far from labor and battle they live. He described festivals of unimaginable beauty, where the Hyperboreans danced and feasted under Apollo's eternal patronage, where the Muses themselves were in constant attendance. What are we to make of these accounts? Modern scholars typically interpret Hyperborea as pure mythology, a Greek expression of utopian longing. A paradise imagined to exist in the unknown reaches beyond civilization's boundaries. Like Atlantis or Shangri-La, Hyperborea serves as a repository for cultural fantasies, a place where human imperfection is transcended and life achieves an ideal state. But consider the consistent details. The 6-month day is not fantasy. It is precise astronomical reality at polar latitudes. North of the Arctic Circle, the sun does remain above the horizon for months during summer, creating conditions of continuous light that match exactly the descriptions of Hyperborea. The Greeks lived in a world where such phenomena were not common knowledge. How did they come to describe so accurately a condition that exists only in latitudes far beyond their usual experience? One possibility is that the Greeks encountered peoples who had themselves traveled to or heard accounts from Arctic regions. The amber trade routes connected the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, bringing not just fossilized resin, but also stories from northern lands. Scythian nomads ranged across vast territories of the Eurasian steppe and maintained contact with both Greek colonies and more northern peoples. Through these chains of contact, information about the Arctic's unique conditions might have filtered south, becoming embellished and mythologized in the retelling. But another interpretation emerges if we take seriously the possibility of climatic change and lost Arctic civilizations. What if Hyperborea preserves garbled memories of an actual culture that existed in the far north during a warm climatic phase? A people who did inhabit regions of midnight sun, who had developed a stable society adapted to Arctic conditions, who appeared to Greek travelers, encountering them through distant intermediaries, to live in unusual prosperity and health because their adaptation to the environment was so successful. The Greeks specifically associated Hyperborea with longevity and freedom from disease. Interestingly, some modern research suggests that populations living in extreme environments do develop unique health adaptations. Cold adaptation affects metabolism, immune function, and aging processes in ways that might confer certain advantages. If a population had lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, they would have undergone genetic selection for traits that enhance survival in extreme cold and darkness, adaptations that might manifest as unusual robustness. The connection to Apollo deserves consideration. Apollo was not just a sun god, but a deity of healing, prophecy, music, and civilized order. The Greeks associated him with rational knowledge and civilizing influences. If Hyperborea was Apollo's particular domain, might this suggest that the Greeks perceived the Hyperboreans as possessing advanced knowledge, perhaps astronomical wisdom derived from observing the unique polar skies, or medical understanding developed through necessity in a harsh environment? The Greek texts mention that Apollo himself traveled to Hyperborea annually, spending the winter months there before returning to Greece in spring. This curious detail might preserve a kernel of astronomical observation. In polar latitudes, the sun does depart for winter, disappearing below the horizon for months during the polar night. Its return in spring is a dramatic and emotionally powerful event, marked by many Arctic cultures as a moment of renewal and celebration. Could the myth of Apollo's journey to Hyperborea encode observations about solar behavior at extreme latitudes? Some esoteric traditions have claimed Hyperborea as the original homeland of European peoples, a northern Atlantis from which civilization spread southward. These theories venture far into speculation, often mixed with troubling ideological agendas and lack archaeological support. Yet they point to a persistent intuition that something important existed in the north, something foundational to later cultures, something lost. The Roman poet Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described Hyperborea in his Natural History with the matter-of-fact tone he used for discussing actual places. Behind these mountains beyond the north wind, there dwells a happy people called Hyperboreans, who live to extreme old age. Here are the hinges on which the world turns, the extreme limits of the revolutions of the stars. The language is poetic, but the presentation is geographical. Pliny treats Hyperborea as a real location, however remote and idealized. Could Hyperborea be a memory of Beringia, that vast subcontinent that connected Asia to America and supported human populations for thousands of years before drowning? Or might it reference a warm phase Arctic, where conditions allowed stable settlement, far north of usual human ranges? Or is it simply the universal human tendency to project paradise onto unknown territories, to imagine that somewhere beyond the horizon, life achieves perfection denied to us in the imperfect present? The texts offer no definitive answer. Hyperborea remains suspended between history and myth, between memory and imagination. A land beyond the north wind that might have existed or might never have been more than a beautiful dream of warmth and light at the edge of the frozen world. But the dream persists, and persistence itself suggests something, a need, an intuition, a fragment of truth that refuses to be entirely dismissed. In the stories of Hyperborea, the Arctic becomes not a wasteland, but a cradle, not a tomb, but a birthplace, not death, but eternal life under the midnight sun. The myth remembers, even if we have forgotten what it remembers. As the centuries turned into millennia, another theory emerged to explain the Arctic's secrets, one more catastrophic and unsettling than gradual climate change. The theory of crustal displacement, sometimes called pole shift, proposes that Earth's outer crust can rotate independently from its inner core, causing entire continents to shift dramatically in latitude. Under this scenario, regions that were once temperate could suddenly find themselves in polar latitudes, while polar regions might move toward the equator. The shift would be geologically rapid, occurring over decades or centuries rather than millions of years, bringing catastrophic climate change to affected areas. The hypothesis has been championed by various researchers over the decades, most notably by Charles Hapgood in the mid-20th century. Hapgood proposed that the weight of ice sheets during glacial periods could create imbalances that eventually trigger a sudden shift in Earth's crust. Albert Einstein found the idea intriguing enough to write a foreword to Hapgood's book, though he cautioned that the mechanism remained uncertain. Mainstream geology rejects crustal displacement as implausible, given our current understanding of plate tectonics and the forces that govern crustal movement. The energy required to rotate the entire crust would be staggering, and no known mechanism could generate such forces. The geological evidence for pole shift, rapid changes in magnetic orientation in rock strata, fossil distributions that seem to place tropical species in polar regions, can be explained more simply through plate tectonics, operating over long time scales. Yet the theory refuses to die entirely, particularly in discussions of Arctic mysteries. Because if crustal displacement did occur in the relatively recent past, say, at the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago, it would explain several anomalies that conventional models struggle to address. It would explain how the mammoths of Siberia appear to have frozen so rapidly that undigested food remains in their stomachs, not gradual climate cooling over centuries, but sudden catastrophic freeze as their latitude shifted abruptly. It would explain ancient maps showing Antarctica ice-free if the continent was once in a more temperate location before shifting to its current polar position. It would explain geological evidence of tropical conditions in what are now polar regions, if those regions were once much further from the poles. And it would explain the sudden drowning of coastal civilizations worldwide at the end of the Ice Age. The Standard Model attributes sea level rise to melting ice sheets, which is certainly accurate. But if ice sheets melted catastrophically during a crustal shift, as regions of ice suddenly found themselves in warmer latitudes, the sea level rise would be not gradual, but sudden overwhelming coastal settlements in a matter of years or decades. The myth of the Great Flood appears in cultures worldwide, from the biblical account to Mesopotamian epics, to Native American legends, to Aboriginal Australian stories. These narratives describe a world-destroying deluge that erased previous civilizations, after which humanity had to begin anew. Conventional explanations suggest these myths preserve memories of local flooding events or the gradual post-glacial sea level rise. But the myths describe something more dramatic, a sudden catastrophe that reshaped the world, not a slow process spanning millennia. If crustal displacement occurred, Arctic civilizations would have faced the ultimate catastrophe. Imagine communities adapted to a temperate climate suddenly thrust into polar latitudes. Within a single generation, summer temperatures would plummet. Winter darkness would extend for months. Ice sheets would begin forming, advancing across lands that had been farmland or hunting grounds. The stars themselves would appear to shift in the sky as latitude changed. The sun's path would alter, rising and setting at different points on the horizon, climbing to different heights at noon. Such changes would be interpreted as cosmic catastrophe, as the gods themselves remaking the world. Survivors fleeing southward would carry stories of a homeland destroyed, of a world that ended, of ancestors who lived in a place that no longer existed in the same form. These stories would become myths of paradise lost, of golden ages before the current imperfect world, of civilizations destroyed by divine wrath or cosmic forces beyond human control. The evidence for recent crustal displacement remains contested and largely unconvincing to mainstream science. But the theory speaks to something deep in human intuition about the Arctic, the sense that this frozen waste conceals secrets from a time when it was something utterly different, when the very relationship between land and sky was not as we know it now. Modern research into Earth's magnetic field offers intriguing complications. The magnetic poles do wander significantly over time, and the field has reversed many times in geological history, north becoming south, south becoming north. During reversals, the field weakens dramatically, potentially affecting climate through increased cosmic radiation. Some reversals occur rapidly in geological terms, over just a few thousand years. Could a magnetic reversal, even without physical crustal displacement, have effects catastrophic enough to explain Arctic mysteries? Increased radiation might affect weather patterns, triggering rapid climate changes. The weakened magnetic field might allow solar storms to penetrate deeper into the atmosphere, auroras appearing at low latitudes, strange lights in the sky that would seem to herald cosmic disaster. The stars would not shift their positions during a magnetic reversal. Only the direction of Earth's magnetic field would change. But to ancient peoples who navigated by both stars and magnetic minerals, lodestone compasses were known in ancient times. The experience might be profoundly disorienting. The lodestone that once pointed steadily north might swing wildly or reverse entirely. The stars would remain fixed, but the magnetic world would unmoor itself from the celestial one. Whether through crustal displacement, magnetic reversal, or catastrophic climate shifts, the end of the last ice age was a time of extraordinary transformation. The world that emerged 12,000 years ago was radically different from the one that preceded it. Entire landscapes drowned, ice sheets collapsed, megafauna went extinct, and human societies had to adapt or perish. If Arctic civilizations existed before this transformation, they would have been among the most affected. Their world would have ended not through gradual change, but through catastrophe. The sky shifting, the seas rising, the ice advancing or retreating with terrifying speed. Their survival would have depended on abandoning everything, on fleeing to new lands, on reinventing their cultures in unfamiliar conditions. What they carried with them was memory, encoded in myth and ritual, and fragments of astronomical knowledge and geographical lore. The memory of a time when the world was different, when their ancestors lived in places that no longer exist, under skies that no longer shine the same way. The theory of crustal displacement may be wrong. The specific mechanisms proposed may not work, but the intuition it expresses, that something catastrophic happened, that the world was remade, that the Arctic holds secrets from before, the remaking. That intuition resonates because it aligns with what the myths tell us, what the geological record suggests, what the drowned coastlines and buried forests whisper. Something changed. The sky shifted, if not literally, then in the experience of those who watched the stars and found their world transformed. As the Ice Age ended and warmth returned to the northern latitudes, the Arctic became the stage for one of the most dramatic episodes in Earth's recent history, floods on a scale that defies modern imagination. For tens of thousands of years, continental ice sheets had locked up vast quantities of water. The North American ice sheet covered most of Canada under ice 3 kilometers thick. The Scandinavian ice sheet buried northern Europe. Smaller ice caps covered mountain ranges and Arctic islands. Together, these ice masses contained enough frozen water to lower global sea levels by 120 meters below present. Then the climate shifted. Summer temperatures rose. The ice began to melt. The process was not gradual and smooth. Glacial melt is chaotic, catastrophic, pulsed. Ice sheets don't simply diminish steadily like a slowly melting ice cube. They collapse in surges and jumps as internal dynamics create instabilities. Meltwater accumulates under the ice, lubricating its base, causing entire sections to slide rapidly toward the sea. Ice dams form at the margins, holding back vast glacial lakes that suddenly burst free when the dams fail. The Missoula floods in North America provide a window into these processes. At the end of the Ice Age, a lobe of ice dammed the Clark Fork River in Montana, creating Glacial Lake Missoula, a body of water containing over 2,000 cubic kilometers, comparable to Lake Ontario. When the ice dam failed, and it failed repeatedly, perhaps 40 times over 2,000 years, the lake emptied catastrophically. The entire volume of water drained in as little as 48 hours, racing across the landscape at speeds up to 100 kilometers per hour, gouging channels through solid bedrock carrying boulders the size of houses hundreds of kilometers downstream. The landscape of eastern Washington still bears the scars, a surreal terrain of channeled scablands, where valleys were carved in days and waterfalls hundreds of meters high existed briefly before the floods drained and the rivers returned to normal. This is what glacial melt looks like when ice dams fail, not slow erosion, but catastrophic reshaping of entire regions. Similar floods occurred throughout the Arctic as the Ice Age ended. In Siberia, vast glacial lakes formed as southern ice melted, while northern rivers remained frozen, creating natural dams. When these dams broke, floods of biblical proportions roared across the landscape toward the Arctic Ocean. Geologists mapping ancient flood channels in Siberia find evidence of water flows that dwarf modern rivers, channels hundreds of meters deep, carved in single episodes of flooding. But the Arctic was not just the source of floods, it was also a victim. As ice sheets melted, the water had to go somewhere. Sea levels rose rapidly, not smoothly, but in pulses known as meltwater pulses. The best studied of these occurred approximately 14,500 years ago, when sea levels jumped by perhaps 20 meters within 5 centuries, an average of 4 meters per century. For coastal communities, such rates would be catastrophic, drowning entire settlement areas within a few generations. Another pulse occurred around 8,500 years ago, associated with the final collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet over Hudson Bay. When the ice dam containing Lake Agassiz, a glacial lake larger than all current Great Lakes combined, finally broke, it drained catastrophically into the North Atlantic. The influx of cold fresh water disrupted ocean circulation patterns, triggering rapid climate changes that affected the entire northern hemisphere. The Arctic coastlines bore the brunt of these changes. What had been broad coastal plains during the Ice Age became first marshes, then lagoons, then open ocean as sea levels rose. Communities that had occupied these lowlands for millennia would have faced stark choices: retreat inland, adapt to increasingly waterlogged conditions, or abandon their homelands entirely. Archaeological evidence of this period is scarce precisely because the settlements most likely to have been significant, those on rich coastal lowlands with access to marine and terrestrial resources, are now underwater. Modern archaeology focuses on sites that remain accessible on dry land, but these may not be representative. The true population centers, the places where resources were richest and cultures most developed, may lie beneath Arctic seas. Occasionally, evidence surfaces. Storm surges expose artifacts from drowned shorelines. Fishing trawlers pull up stone tools and worked bone from depths of 50 meters. Offshore oil surveys detect what might be ancient peat layers containing pollen and organic material from terrestrial ecosystems now submerged. Each fragment hints at the vanished world of the Arctic coasts. The floods would have been visible, dramatic, terrifying. Imagine witnessing the disintegration of the Ice Age world from an Arctic coastal settlement. Each spring, the rivers would swell higher, carrying more meltwater from disintegrating inland ice. Icebergs would appear along the coast, massive floating mountains of ice calving from glaciers that were themselves retreating inland year by year. The sea would rise, slowly at first, then faster, claiming beaches, then low-lying camps, then entire valleys. Some floods would come with no warning. An ice dam upstream fails in the night, and by dawn a wall of water 3 stories high is racing down the valley. Everything in its path is swept away. People, animals, dwellings, everything. The survivors watch from high ground as their world is scoured clean, rearranged into unfamiliar configurations of mud and debris. These catastrophes would enter oral tradition as the Great Flood, the world-destroying deluge that erased the old order and forced humanity to begin anew. The stories would emphasize the totality of the destruction, the intervention of divine or cosmic forces, the survival of only a few who would repopulate the earth. Because from the perspective of those who lived through it, this is exactly what happened. The floods eventually subsided as the Ice Age ended and a new equilibrium established itself. Sea levels stabilized at approximately their current positions around 6,000 years ago. The Arctic coastlines we know today emerged from the chaos, but they bear little resemblance to the Ice Age coasts that preceded them. An entire geography is lost, drowned beneath hundreds of meters of ocean, accessible only to specialized submarine archaeology and the imagination. Somewhere beneath the Barents Sea, beneath the Kara Sea, beneath the shallow water surrounding Arctic islands, the bones of the old world lie in sediment and darkness. The floods that drowned them were so vast, so powerful, that they should have erased all traces. Yet fragments survive, waiting for the patience and technology that will someday bring them to light. The ocean took the coasts, but kept them too, preserved in cold, dark water where human memory cannot reach, but where the past waits, silent, patient, slowly accumulating sediment like layers in a forgotten grave. Pause again on a detail that transforms our understanding of what the Arctic keeps hidden. In 2007, a Nenets reindeer herder named Yuri Kuti was leading his herd across the Yamal Peninsula in northwestern Siberia when he noticed something protruding from a thawing riverbank. Curious, he investigated and found himself staring at the intact body of a woolly mammoth calf. The calf, later named Luba, after Kuti's wife, was perhaps the most perfectly preserved mammoth ever discovered. She had died approximately 42,000 years ago, at 1 month old, and the permafrost had kept her in a state of preservation that defied belief. Her trunk was intact, her eyelashes visible, her internal organs so well preserved that scientists could examine her last meal in her digestive system. She appeared to have died quickly, possibly suffocating on mud while trying to drink from a river, then been buried in sediment that froze solid and never thawed for 42 millennia. Luba is extraordinary, but not unique. The Siberian permafrost regularly yields preserved megafauna: mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lion cubs, ancient horses. In 2018, scientists recovered a 40-2-thousand-year-old foal from permafrost in Yakutia. Its coat still lustrous, its hooves intact, liquid blood still in its vessels. These are not fossils in the traditional sense. They are bodies, preserved so perfectly that they appear recently dead rather than impossibly ancient. The implications for human archaeology are staggering. If permafrost can preserve mammoths with eyelashes intact for 40,000 years, what might it preserve of human presence? In regions where humans lived during the Ice Age, permafrost might contain artifacts and remains in states of preservation unknown elsewhere in archaeology. Indeed, human burials from permafrost regions sometimes emerge in astonishing condition. The Ice Maiden, discovered in the Altai Mountains of Siberia in 1993, was a Scythian woman buried 2,500 years ago in permafrost that never thawed. Her tattoos were visible on preserved skin, her clothing intact, the felt and fabric showing original colors and patterns. Inside her burial, silk from China and coriander seeds from the Mediterranean testified to trade connections spanning continents. But 2,500 years is recent compared to the Ice Age. What might lie deeper, older, buried in regions that have remained frozen since the world was young? Wooden structures that should have rotted, but instead froze solid. Leather clothing that should have decayed, but was preserved the day it was laid aside. Tools with wooden halves still attached, rope and cordage intact. Organic materials that never survive in normal archaeological contexts. The challenge is finding these treasures before climate change does it for us, and in the wrong way. As the Arctic warms, permafrost is thawing at accelerating rates. Ancient organic material, exposed to air and warmth for the first time in millennia, begins to decompose almost immediately. Microbes dormant for eons wake and begin consuming the tissues. Erosion washes fragile artifacts into rivers. The preservation that lasted 10,000 years can be undone in a single summer. Scientists are racing against time, trying to locate and excavate significant permafrost sites before they thaw and their contents are lost forever. But the Arctic is vast, and the resources for systematic archaeology are limited. For every site documented and studied, dozens or hundreds likely thaw unobserved, their contents decomposing without anyone knowing what was lost. The permafrost has been a vault, a library, a time capsule, preserving the Arctic's past in exquisite detail. But the vault is opening, not in a controlled way that allows careful study, but chaotically, randomly, with most of the contents being destroyed as they're released. What stories are written in the bodies emerging from thawing permafrost? What technologies, what knowledge, what evidence of Arctic civilizations is melting into rivers and returning to the Earth before we can read what they have to tell us? The ice preserved everything. The thaw is erasing it, day by day, summer by summer, like a book burning one page at a time while we struggle to read faster than the flames consume the text. The permafrost kept its secrets well. Now, whether we are ready or not, it is beginning to speak in fragments, in glimpses, in treasures and terrors emerging from the cold into a world that has forgotten they were there.